Immediately after the Second World War, Grand Prix motor racing quickly got back into full swing. Before the war, Alphas had been dominant until they were crushed by the might of Auto Union and Mercedes. After the war, they quickly re-established Grand Prix dominance. They were, after all, the only one of the three left. That is until 1949. Alphas had a bad year in 1948, losing 3 of their top drivers, and were therefore uncompetitive in 49. A new constructor took advantage of the situation and swept the board. Enzo Ferrari was his name, and he had been a driver and an employee of Alfa Romeo. And although it took him 3 years to beat Alphas on their own terms, when it finally happened, he's reported to have said, "It was like killing my mother." But in killing his mother, he fathered a whole new line of automobiles which were to be synonymous with engineering perfection. If you were to ask anyone what they would think of as style in a car, they'd almost certainly nominate either an Italian car or one which had been influenced by Italian designers. This influence was first brought to bear after the Second World War. The reason it came about was simple, just that only Italy, of all the manufacturing countries, enjoyed a proliferation of small specialist body designers. The 2 of these who became virtually household names were Pininfarina and Bertone. Pininfarina made his name with this car, the Cisitalia. It was first shown in 1947. Cisitalia heralded a whole new era of design, an era of aerodynamic cleanliness, of technological innovation, of sculptured curves and smooth flowing lines that fit form to function and allow quite small engines to power quite spacious vehicles. It's an era that's lasted right up to the present day. There were many severe limitations imposed on the designers of cars in Europe in these days. For example, there was a lack of raw materials, so the cars had to be compact. And because there was no premium grade fuel, they had to run low compression engines. And most countries tax cars according to their horsepower, so that had to be kept down too. Keeping all of those features in mind, one can begin to appreciate just how brilliant the Cisitalia really was. It had a small engine, but it was very slippery through the air. And Pininfarina had made very effective use of relatively small space. All of these features became hallmarks of Pininfarina design, and he later went on to design for Peugeot, BMC, Fiat, Ferrari, and Lancia with cars like this, the Monte Carlo. In 1954, his rival Bertone made his mark with the Alfa Romeo Giulietta Sprint, a design so successful that Alfa have stuck doggedly to it for the last 20 years. The success of both Pininfarina and Bertone made it possible for them to experiment lavishly with large fashion exercises for motor shows. Although they were rarely practical cars as such, these exercises were an excellent attention getter for the designers' more serious work, and thus they ensured a continuing flow of new ideas. Bertone's later credits included Jaguar, BMC, Lancia, Lamborghini and Fiat. By the mid-1950s, the stylists had begun to dictate the mechanical trends as well, and this was particularly so in the USA. People, as a result of promotion and advertising, had decided that they wanted certain so-called new features, and it was possible for the manufacturers of cars to make almost no functional changes at all to provide these new features and still come up with a new model each year. As a result, the engineers were forced to submerge their feelings and their talents beneath a great mass of chrome and steel and glass. There were, however, a few good features in the new designs. The first landmark was this Studebaker designed by Raymond Loewy. You can tell at a glance that European styling was not for him. It was the first car about which people said, but you can't tell whether it's coming or going. But it does have some real qualities. For example, this three-block design's not such a bad thing. A big bonnet, a big passenger compartment, and a big boot, all of which makes for great comfort, and particularly when it was coupled to the developing soft suspensions of the day, which in fact also didn't do much for the handling. But then handling was becoming less important because of the development of great expressways. Take a look at all that glass. That's something the Europeans weren't into yet. In fact, that bespeaks the American car of the day. Comfort, spaciousness and luxury, and with practically no thought for economy whatsoever. Take a look, for example, at the integrated bumper bars, which did nothing at all to save the cost of replacement parts because they did nothing to protect the body panels in case of a collision of any kind. In 1954, Studebaker merged with Packard, and one result of the marriage was this, the last true Packard, and you can already see Raymond Loewy's basically simple concepts were being smothered in a purist nightmare. And I can well imagine that old James Ward Packard would have been spinning in his grave. However, it is worth noting that cars like this went on refining all the comfort items that we associate with American design, and which were so often conspicuously lacking in European cars in the 50s. American sedans of this era were chrome-plated lounge rooms on wheels. And the Chevrolet Corvette was their answer to the sports car. The Chevrolet Corvette was released in 1954, and up until that time, almost all the sports cars that were sold to the American buying public had come from overseas manufacturers. General Motors had decided to try for a home market for the sports car, came up with the Corvette, and it was in fact very different from the idea of a sports car as conceived by
other manufacturers in other parts of the world. In fact, for a while, a number of people wondered whether they were being serious or not, but they were, and for the market it was attempting to get to, it was really quite successful. It's very small by the standards of the American cars of the day, and that was sporty, and with the hood down it was sleek, interesting. But in terms of true sports car performance, it wasn't especially good on corners and road holding. It came equipped principally with automatic transmissions, which was pretty strange for a sports car market. There was a manual, it was a 3-speed, and it was an option, and it wasn't extremely well received except by those true blue enthusiasts who wanted to do all the driving themselves. The V8 engine power pack for it was really very good in classic American tradition, and what it created of the Corvette was a very fast car, ideally suited to fast freeway style touring, but not specially good for roads like this. As soon as they start to push this car hard on these sort of roads, it has this tendency to pick up its reasonably stiff live rear axle and start spinning the inside wheel. It doesn't put its power down very effectively. It's a strange car. It's certainly not bad, it's really quite comfortable. But it's not a sports car by any of the standards that were applying in 1954. The British seem to have fallen by the wayside a bit by this time. It's probably fair to say they were still suffering from the ramifications of the war. The amalgamation of Austin and Morris into BMC and the eventual takeover of routes by Chrysler were significant pointers to the future. The wealthy were still catered for, but there was very little going in the middle range market. There were still sports cars around too, with the release of the MGA and the Lotus Elite. But the most striking cars of the decade, apart from the Morris Minor, were the down-market duo, the first of which was the A30 by Austin of England. The A30 was grandson to Herbert Austin's Chummy of the 20s and 30s, and although it was a practical car, it lacked the Chummy's charm. And from a design and styling point of view, about all one can say of it was that it was as British as a boiled egg. The second of the duo was the Ford Popular, a car so marvellously designed that it was almost possible for it to roll over while it was standing at the curb. Incidentally, the Ford Motor Company went back 70 years to rediscover the front suspension for this car. The transverse semi-elliptic spring, mounted to a beam axle, came straight from the days of the horse and cart. I mentioned MG and Lotus just a moment ago, and I should have mentioned that there are other sports cars of the 1950s. It was an era of good sports cars, which kind of made up for the fact that the sedan cars of the period were so dull. The Triumph organisation began building cars in 1923, so by 1953, when they released their TR2, they'd had some 30 years of experience, and one would have thought that their very first sports car for a new era might have been a top car. The TR2 was the second sports car of a period, hence TR2. There was a TR1,
but it never got beyond prototype stage because it was such a disaster. Triumph called in an outside engineer from BRM and they revised the whole car, and then finally when the TR2 was released it was really quite good and quite successful, and it vied magnificently with another couple of sports cars of the period, the Austin Healey being one of them, for a very lucrative market. Most of the early TRs went to the United States. That's where the money was. The 2 was one of the better cars of Triumph's TR range. It remained traditional in most senses except in body styling, which was definitely influenced by the Italians, as in fact you can see in its rounded panels and flowing lines. But practicality was allowed to rule over style. The cutaway doors made it far easier to drive than the Austin Healey, for example, which had a straight panel which gave you no room to get your elbows working behind the wheel. The 2's best feature was its engine. Long stroke, good power, terrific torque and almost unburstable. It could go for hours at high speeds with no problems at all. The gearbox was good but somewhat notchy, and it was supplemented by an electric overdrive. The worst feature? Steering and handling, which were average and certainly not as good as they should have been for a sports car of the day. In Germany, Mercedes were attacking the top end of the sports car market with their Gullwing 300S, and although it's clearly a little brother to the Mercedes 50s races, you can already see the Italian influence. Still solidly Germanic, but the classic smooth bullet shape is beginning to appear.
When the 300 SL first came on the market, it caused a great deal of controversy. A lot of people said it was great, and a lot of people were quite literally frightened by it. I can understand why. It's a very powerful car with some tricky handling characteristics, and it does require some very good driving to get the best out of it. One thing worries me. If you happen to roll into a ditch somewhere, it could be some time before you could ever get out, because these gull-wing doors are not all that easy to open while the car's upside down. But then again, it's much less likely to roll over than a Ford Popular.
The 300 SL Gullwing was the logical successor to those magnificent pre-war Mercedes. Large, powerful, somewhat brutish monsters of cars they were. Likewise, the delicate and very beautiful Italian cars of the 1920s had their successors in names like Maserati, Lamborghini, and of course, Ferrari. Enzo Ferrari was born in 1898, and by the 1920s had become a team driver for Alfa Romeo and raced with considerable success. Later, he became an Alfa distributor and subsequently a team manager for an Alfa racing team. And he held that position almost right up until the war. In 1946, Ferrari made a declaration to the world. He would henceforth take on all comers in cars bearing his own name. It's needless now to talk of his success. The names tell it all. Fangio, Ascari, Collins, Hawthorne, Hill, Gurney, Surtees, and more recently, Lauda, Reutemann and Scheckter.
And while his red races were whirling around the circuits of the world, Ferrari sports and GT cars became the envy of the world's road drivers. For me, the most impressive feature of all the 12-cylinder Ferraris is this. It's not really surprising that I like that sound. If Ferrari had a specialty, it was engines, and specially 12-cylinder engines. In the early days they were V12s, but more recently flat 12s. Strangely enough, there's never been a Ferrari that I wasn't just a little disappointed in. I don't know why. I guess it's because you come to expect so much and there's no such thing as the perfect car. This car, for example, is fantastic. It's very beautiful to drive, but it's got inadequate brakes. And for a car of its performance, I can't imagine why, because there were plenty of good disc brakes around at the time. It handles impeccably and sits really beautifully on the road. It's very accurate, very light, quite docile to drive really, with a marvellous 5-speed gearbox that does, however, take just a little bit of getting used to if you're not conversant with gate shifts. Now that simply means that each shift has got to be quite positive because it locks into a special gate mechanism, but it is fantastic to use. The joy of Ferrari driving is that you can dawdle along like this very comfortably, and if you want to go just a little quicker, slip it back a gear and away you go. That's what Grand Touring is all about, true style. While the Italians were exploring the outer limits of styling, Citroën in France were, as usual, exploring the outer limits of technology. Following their success with the Light 15, which incidentally followed the Ford Maxim in that it was available in any colour at all so long as it was black, Citroën released the DS19. Ahead of its time in 1955, it is still a very advanced car with front-wheel drive, self-levelling suspension, power-assisted clutch and steering, and load-sensitive brakes with discs up front. Citroën were maintaining their reputation for innovation. There was one other piece of radical innovation in Europe in those days, and frankly, it's one that's always terrified me: the bubble car. It took the problems of Europe, that is of manufacturing and fuel costs, to their logical extreme and solved them with such deadly designs as Isetta, Goggomobil, and this Messerschmitt. Imagine being hit in the side in this, even with something as small as a Mini. Personally, I'd rather walk, but they did sell. In the long term, thank heaven, such cars were to have a limited life, based on an increasing worldwide awareness of the need for safety in car design. By the end of the 1950s, the statistical evidence that the car was becoming the greatest people killer in the history of man was conclusive. And two new terms were entering the motor industry vernacular: those two terms were primary and secondary safety. This is a 300 Mercedes-Benz of the 1955s. At the time that safety legislation was proposed and became prominent and significant in the world, the Daimler-Benz organisation were very quick to begin promoting safety, both primary and secondary, in their cars. Primary safety, in a nutshell, is a composite of three specific characteristics of car performance. Its ability to go, stop, and handle, that is, turn corners, change direction, whatever you like. Going, simply, a good turn of acceleration, the ability to pull you away from a troublesome situation, to allow you to overtake rapidly with no hesitation when you put your foot on the accelerator, and with good clean power available right throughout the whole range. To stop, obviously, quickly, in a straight line, smoothly, and to go on stopping if more than one stop in succession is needed. And handling, the ability to make changes of direction, corners certainly, but also to swerve and recover any change of direction with a great deal of accuracy and smoothness and response and feedback to the driver. All of these things as a mix combined to make it possible for the driver to avoid the potential collision situation in the first place. Primary safety. Secondary safety, on the other hand, is the ability of the vehicle to withstand an impact of one sort or another, and in doing so, to protect the occupants from injury as far as it is possible to do so. Actually, there was an easier way to identify primary and secondary safety features at this time. You could think of all American cars as being very strong on secondary safety features, but not too good on primary safety features. Strong on secondary safety because they were very big and very strong, but not so good on primary safety features because they weren't too good at stopping and they didn't handle terribly well. And conversely, think of all the Europeans, small cars particularly, as being especially strong on primary safety but not too good on secondary safety, because as a result of their smallness they could injure you if they were involved in a collision, and especially with a larger vehicle. There was about to be a trend throughout the world towards super small cars, and it was to be led by a car designed by Alec Issigonis, a car which would take the whole of the world by storm. That car, of course, was the Mini.